I still have the boarding pass from the flight I never took, tucked between the pages of my mother's memorial program, yellowed by time but preserved as evidence of the choice that haunts me most. No one plans to become the person who misses their mother's funeral. There's no gradual decline into that kind of selfishness, no conscious decision to prioritize a lover's fabricated crisis over a parent's final farewell. Or at least that's what I told myself in the aftermath. The painful truth was simpler. The path to that moment had been paved with 1,000 smaller choices, each one undermining my boundaries until I could no longer recognize even the most sacred of obligations. Before we get into the part that still hurts to tell, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss more deep, raw stories like this. I met Daniel at 27 at the tail end of a string of relationships that had left me convinced that love required perpetual compromise. Not the healthy give and take of equals, but the slow erosion of self to accommodate another's needs. My romantic history read like a case study in diminishing returns, each partner taking more while offering less, each relationship leaving me with a reduced sense of what I deserved. Daniel seemed different at first, ambitious, charming, passionate about his startup tech company that was perpetually on the verge of a breakthrough. His intensity felt like conviction rather than control. His focus read as dedication rather than self-absorption. His emotional unpredictability seemed like depth instead of manipulation. In the beginning, I mistook his need for constant reassurance and support as vulnerability rather than the warning sign it actually was. Our first date stretched from dinner to drinks to dawn, his monologue about his business plans and family trauma punctuated by just enough questions about my life to maintain the illusion of reciprocity. By morning, I knew his father had abandoned the family when he was 12, his mother had struggled with depression throughout his childhood, and his sister had always been the favored child. I knew his business had nearly secured funding 3 times before deals collapsed at the last minute due to circumstances he presented as completely beyond his control. What I didn't recognize then was how these stories served multiple purposes, establishing him as simultaneously exceptional and victimized, deserving of both admiration and accommodation, creating a narrative where his success was constantly thwarted by others' failings, never his own limitations or choices, setting the expectation that supporting his dreams would become my primary purpose. I shared less about myself during those early hours together, not because he didn't ask, he did, with what seemed like genuine interest, but because my stories felt smaller in comparison. My stable childhood with parents who remained married for 43 years, my modest career as a graphic designer at a mid-sized advertising agency, my ordinary ambitions for creative fulfillment and eventually starting a family. Next to his dramatic past and grandiose visions, my life seemed unremarkable, my dreams pedestrian. That initial imbalance established the pattern that would define our relationship. His needs were urgent, exceptional, demanding immediate attention. Mine were routine, ordinary, easily deferred. His emotions required careful management and constant reassurance. Mine could be set aside in service of stabilizing his volatile moods. His work represented potential greatness perpetually on the verge of recognition. Mine was simply a job, a paycheck, something that could be compromised when his needs demanded flexibility. The first sacrifice came 3 months into our relationship. A weekend work retreat I'd been looking forward to for months, a creative workshop in the mountains with industry leaders I admired, the kind of professional development opportunity that comes rarely in a career. 2 days before the event, Daniel's latest potential investor pulled out unexpectedly. His devastation was all-consuming, his need for support absolute. I canceled my plans without real deliberation. It seemed like the only option at the time. His crisis was immediate and overwhelming. My opportunity, though important to my career, felt secondary by comparison. He didn't explicitly ask me to stay, he never had to. His emotional collapse accomplished what direct demands never could have, total capitulation disguised as compassionate choice. That weekend established the blueprint for what followed. His gratitude was effusive but fleeting. By Sunday evening, when the storm had passed, my sacrifice went unacknowledged. When I mentioned the workshop I'd missed, he seemed genuinely surprised that I was still thinking about it. His dismissal carried an implicit message. Once a sacrifice has been made, it shouldn't be referenced again. Generosity that requires recognition becomes something else entirely, a transaction rather than a gift. I absorbed this lesson without consciously recognizing it, began to make sacrifices without mentioning them, started to take pride in my capacity to give without expectation of reciprocity or even acknowledgement, reframed my diminishing sense of self as growth in selflessness, mistook my shrinking world for evidence of deepening commitment. The pattern escalated gradually over the next 2 years. Small concessions evolved into larger ones. Occasional emotional support became constant psychological management. Professional compromises transformed into career limitations as I chose positions with greater flexibility and fewer demands, better suited to accommodating Daniel's unpredictable crises. My relationships outside the partnership suffered accordingly. Friends grew tired of canceled plans and conversations that revolved around Daniel's latest projects and problems. Family expressed increasing concern about my fading presence in their lives. My mother, especially, noticed the changes in me before I could recognize them myself. During one of our monthly phone calls, briefer than they had once been, scheduled around Daniel's needs rather than our mutual convenience, she asked the question that should have served as warning rather than irritation. Do you ever wonder if you're disappearing into his life at the expense of your own? I defended the relationship reflexively with the practiced responses I'd developed to deflect similar concerns from friends. Daniel was under unique pressure. His business was at a critical juncture. Once the current crisis passed, things would balance naturally. He appreciated my support more than he could express. This phase was temporary. My mother listened patiently to these familiar justifications before responding with the simple observation that would only later reveal its profound truth. Love shouldn't require you to make yourself smaller. I changed the subject, mildly annoyed by what felt like judgment rather than understanding. Didn't recognize that she was offering insight born from longer perspective, from witnessing more human relationships than my limited experience encompassed. Couldn't hear the concern beneath the observation, not criticism of my choices but fear for what they were costing me. 6 months later, she was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was grim from the start, 6 months at most, likely less. The aggressive disease had remained silent until it was too advanced for effective intervention. Treatment options focused on comfort rather than cure. The clock that had always been ticking suddenly became audible, each moment with her now finite and precious. I shared the news with Daniel the evening after her diagnosis. His response seemed appropriately sympathetic at first, the right words about supporting whatever I needed, appropriate questions about treatment options and family plans, a convincing performance of the partner I needed in that moment. But within 20 minutes, the conversation had shifted to his upcoming investor meeting, his nervous anticipation of a potentially life-changing opportunity, his need for my feedback on the presentation he'd been refining, the implicit message beneath the transition, my crisis acknowledged, now back to his priorities. I didn't confront this redirection, didn't point out the disturbing speed with which my devastation had been noted and then sidelined. Instead, I did what had become automatic, adapted to his needs, set aside my own emotional turmoil, and focused on bolstering his confidence for the upcoming presentation. The following weeks established a pattern that would culminate in the choice I still cannot forgive. As my mother's condition deteriorated with devastating speed, my time became divided between supporting her and managing Daniel's reactions to my divided attention. Each trip home to help care for her was preceded by hours of emotional labor, reassuring Daniel that my temporary absence didn't represent abandonment, soothing his anxiety about handling routine matters without my presence, promising constant availability by phone despite the circumstances. When I was with my mother, my attention remained fragmented, one eye on her declining condition, one on my phone. One ear listening to her increasingly labored breathing, one alert for the text tone that signaled Daniel's latest need or concern. Even in those precious final weeks, I couldn't be fully present with her, couldn't commit my complete attention to memorizing her face, her voice, the unique presence that would soon exist only in memory. If she noticed this division, she never mentioned it, perhaps too focused on her own rapidly approaching horizon to address my misplaced priorities, perhaps too kind to add to my obvious stress with observations that would only burden rather than help, perhaps believing that I would recognize the truth myself when ready to receive it. 3 months after her diagnosis, half the initially predicted time, her doctors confirmed what the accelerating symptoms had already suggested. The end was imminent, days rather than weeks. The time for final conversations, for last expressions of love and gratitude, had arrived with brutal swiftness. I flew home immediately, promising to stay through whatever came next. Daniel expressed appropriate support for this decision while simultaneously reminding me of his upcoming demo day, the culmination of months of work, the presentation that could finally deliver the funding his business needed to survive. The implied expectation hovered beneath his explicitly stated understanding. I would return in time for this critical moment, regardless of other circumstances. 5 days later, as my mother slipped into the unresponsive phase that typically precedes death by hours or days, my phone buzzed with Daniel's name. Not a call he rarely called, preferring the less immediate medium of text that allowed him to express needs without directly hearing potential resistance, but a series of increasingly urgent messages. The demo had been moved up unexpectedly. Key investors could only meet within a 48-hour window. Everything he'd been working toward for 3 years now depended on this single opportunity. He needed me there, needed my stabilizing presence, my practical support, my unwavering belief in his vision when his own confidence faltered. The timing could not have been worse. My mother's breathing had developed the irregular pattern hospice had warned preceded imminent death. The family had gathered, maintaining constant bedside vigil. The funeral home had been contacted, preliminary arrangements discussed. Every indication suggested that within hours, or at most a day or two, she would be gone. What followed was not a dramatic deliberation, but a quiet surrender to established patterns. Not a conscious choice to abandon my dying mother, but the automatic continuation of priorities that had become habitual. Not a decision at all, but the absence of one, the failure to recognize that this moment, above all others, demanded breaking the cycle rather than perpetuating it. I booked a red-eye flight for that night, told my family I needed to handle an emergency but would return immediately afterward, promised to be available by phone throughout my absence, kissed my unconscious mother's forehead and whispered that I would see her soon, a promise that part of me must have known even then would prove impossible to keep. The boarding pass that now rests inside her memorial program represents the flight I took to support Daniel's latest crisis. The flight back, the one I booked for 48 hours later, the one I genuinely believed would return me to my mother's side in time, was never used. She died 6 hours after I left. The funeral was scheduled before I could return. The red-eye I might have taken to at least attend her memorial was preempted by Daniel's continuing need for support through investor follow-up meetings. I watched my mother's funeral via FaceTime, propped on my cousin's phone in the back of the chapel, witnessed her final journey from 1,000 miles away, reduced to a spectator of the farewell I should have helped lead, heard the eulogies others delivered while the words I would have spoken remained unshared. Observed from digital distance as they lowered the casket containing the woman who had given me life and unconditional love into the ground, without her daughter present to cast the traditional final handful of earth. All while sitting in an upscale hotel lobby, waiting for Daniel to emerge from the investor meeting that had seemed more urgent, more important, more deserving of my physical presence than my own mother's funeral. Most devastating realization, the one that would eventually force me to confront the true nature of our relationship, wasn't the choice I had made. It was Daniel's response to that choice, or rather his lack of response, his complete failure to recognize the magnitude of what I had sacrificed, his automatic acceptance of my presence without acknowledgement of its cost, his inability or unwillingness to even say the simple words that might have at least honored the choice, if not justified it. Thank you. The aftermath of my mother's funeral unfolded in disconnected fragments, like scenes from a movie I was watching rather than experiencing. My father's voice on the phone, hollow with grief and confusion about my absence. My sister's text messages, evolving from disbelief to anger to cold acceptance of what she clearly viewed as unforgivable betrayal. My aunt's email detailing who had attended, what had been said, how beautiful the service had been, information shared with mechanical politeness that barely masked her disappointment. These reactions registered distantly, as if happening to someone else. I absorbed them with the same detached functionality that had become my primary mode of operation, acknowledging their validity while simultaneously compartmentalizing their emotional impact. A necessary strategy for maintaining my role in Daniel's life without collapsing under the weight of what that role was costing me. The true confrontation wasn't with my family's justified reaction to my absence. It was with the mounting evidence that had been accumulating for years, suddenly impossible to ignore in the harsh light of this most recent and devastating choice. Evidence: 3 years of systematically canceled plans with friends until invitations stopped arriving altogether. Evidence: a career deliberately kept in maintenance mode rather than growth phase to accommodate the unpredictable demands of Daniel's emotional and professional needs. Evidence: a checking account depleted by repeated temporary loans to cover business expenses during funding gaps, money never repaid, requests for repayment met with wounded disbelief that I would keep score in a relationship supposedly built on mutual support. Evidence: increasing isolation from family, with visits home reduced from monthly to quarterly to holidays only, each one shortened or interrupted by some crisis requiring my return. Evidence: physical symptoms of chronic stress, weight loss, insomnia, recurring headaches, digestive issues, dismissed as unrelated to relationship dynamics when mentioned to Daniel, treated as further evidence of my anxiety issues, rather than reasonable responses to unreasonable demands. Most damningly, evidence, the pattern of Daniel's crises, their suspicious timing consistently aligned with moments when my attention might otherwise be directed elsewhere. The family emergencies that materialized when I had planned professional development opportunities. The business disasters that manifested precisely when my friends organized weekend getaways. The emotional collapses that occurred with remarkable regularity whenever my family needed my presence. This pattern had been present from the beginning, but only now, in the aftermath of the most significant absence, the one I could never rectify, did its deliberate nature become impossible to ignore. Not unconscious neediness but strategic manipulation. Not unfortunate timing but calculated interference. Not genuine emergencies but manufactured crises designed to test and reinforce my prioritization of his needs above all else. The initial confrontation with this evidence occurred not in dramatic revelation, but in quiet moments stolen between Daniel's continuing demands. The morning I found myself staring at my mother's obituary online, recognizing that even in death, I couldn't give her my undivided attention because Daniel had already texted 3 times about his presentation for a follow-up investor meeting. The afternoon I realized I had missed 5 calls from my father while helping Daniel revise his business projections. The evening I caught myself automatically declining my sister's request to visit for the weekend because I anticipated Daniel would need me, though he had not yet expressed any specific plans. These moments accumulated, not building to dramatic breaking point but gradually constructing an alternative perspective from which I could finally observe the relationship with something approaching objectivity. The view wasn't flattering, not to Daniel, whose manipulation became increasingly transparent once identified, but especially not to myself, whose willing participation in my own diminishment could no longer be framed as selfless love, but had to be recognized as something far more troubling. A fundamental belief that my needs, my grief, my life itself mattered less than his momentary comfort and convenience. The external confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't with Daniel but with my sister. 3 weeks after the funeral, she arrived unannounced at my apartment, having flown across 3 states without warning. Her face, so similar to our mother's that seeing it was physically painful, showed no anger, just exhaustion and resolve. She didn't attack or accuse, didn't need to. Instead, she silently handed me a small box containing items our mother had specifically requested I receive after her death. A handwritten letter I still cannot bring myself to fully read. Her wedding ring, to be worn or repurposed as I chose. A small album of photos documenting moments she had particularly treasured between us. And most devastatingly, a voicemail she had saved on her phone and asked my sister to somehow preserve. A message I had left on her birthday 6 months before her diagnosis, before Daniel, full of the uncomplicated love and easy conversation that had characterized our relationship before it became another casualty of my shrinking world. My sister stayed just long enough to ensure I had received these items, declining my mechanical offer of coffee or conversation. Her parting words were not recrimination, but something far more effective in their simple truth. She defended your absence until the end, said you must have had your reasons, said we shouldn't judge what we couldn't understand, loved you enough to create excuses you didn't deserve. This confrontation with my mother's unconditional love, maintained even as I failed to meet its most basic test, broke something fundamental in my carefully constructed justifications. Not dramatic shattering, but quiet crumbling. The slow collapse of elaborate rationalizations under the weight of simple truth. Love had been freely offered, and I had squandered it for something that increasingly appeared to be its hollow imitation. The most difficult evidence to confront wasn't Daniel's manipulation but my own complicity in it. Not his demands but my eagerness to meet them regardless of personal cost. Not his needs but my willingness to elevate them above obligations that should have been sacrosanct. This recognition carried no relief, offered no opportunity to assign blame elsewhere. The responsibility for my choices remained mine alone, regardless of the dysfunctional dynamic that had fostered them. This reckoning might have prompted immediate action, the kind of dramatic relationship exit portrayed in movies or described in self-help books about breaking unhealthy patterns. Reality proved messier, more incremental, less cinematically satisfying. I didn't pack my bags or deliver ultimatums, didn't suddenly develop perfect boundaries or immediately reclaim my independence. The confrontation with evidence produced awareness but not instant transformation. Instead, I began noticing patterns I had previously ignored or justified. The way Daniel subtly undermined relationships that might compete for my attention. The consistent routing of conversations back to his concerns regardless of their starting point. The praise lavished on sacrifices that served his interests, contrasted with dismissive minimization of needs that didn't directly benefit him. The selective memory that retained every instance of support I had provided, while conveniently forgetting commitments he had made and broken. Most significantly, I began recognizing the manipulative tactics deployed when my attention threatened to focus elsewhere. The sudden health concerns that manifested whenever I mentioned visiting my grieving father. The business emergencies that materialized when I attempted to reconnect with neglected friends. The emotional crises that erupted with suspicious timing whenever my own grief threatened to take center stage. The external confrontation with Daniel, when it finally occurred, wasn't dramatic or declarative. No accusations hurled or ultimatums delivered. Instead, it emerged from a simple deviation from established pattern. The first time in our relationship, I declined to abandon an existing commitment to address one of his manufactured crises. 4 months after my mother's funeral, I had finally arranged to visit my father for a weekend. His isolation and grief had become increasingly apparent in our phone conversations. His need for connection, for the comfort of family during this adjustment to solitary life after 43 years of partnership, was both obvious and legitimate. I had postponed this visit twice already due to Daniel's conveniently timed emergencies. Had promised my father this commitment would be kept regardless of competing demands. 2 days before my scheduled departure, Daniel announced his latest crisis, a potential investor suddenly expressing interest, requiring immediate preparation for an unexpected meeting. The timing, like so many emergencies before it, aligned perfectly with my planned absence. The unstated expectation hung in the air between us. I would cancel my trip, would prioritize his need over my commitment, would maintain the established hierarchy that placed his convenience above my obligations to others. For the first time, I didn't immediately comply, didn't offer to cancel my flight or reschedule my visit, didn't automatically assume responsibility for his emotional stability during this latest professional opportunity. Instead, I simply stated that I would be unavailable that weekend due to my previously discussed plans to visit my recently widowed father. His response unveiled in minutes what had been carefully concealed for years behind charm and strategic vulnerability. Not acceptance of reasonable boundaries, but immediate escalation. Not respect for competing obligations, but increasingly dramatic declarations of potential consequences if I failed to provide the support he needed. Not acknowledgement of my right to maintain commitments to others, but intensifying emotional manipulation designed to override any emerging independence. I maintained my original plans, boarded the flight I had promised my father I would take, spent the weekend helping him sort through my mother's belongings, listening to his memories, sitting with him in the complex grief of continuing when his partner of 4 decades was suddenly absent. Throughout that weekend, Daniel's texts and calls arrived with increasing urgency. Each message strategically crafted to penetrate my emerging boundaries, updates on the supposedly critical situation framed to maximize guilt about my absence, reports on his emotional distress positioned to activate my caretaking responses, reminders of past support I had provided, implicitly questioning why this time should be different. My return home brought the confrontation I had both expected and dreaded, not explosive anger but something potentially more effective, wounded victimhood, not direct accusation but implied betrayal. Not stated demands, but the heavy silence of withheld approval, the subtle withdrawal of affection designed to prompt renewed compliance. For the first time, I recognized these tactics for what they were, not genuine emotional responses, but strategic maneuvers in a relationship dynamic built on control rather than reciprocity. Not authentic vulnerability, but performed fragility designed to elicit specific caretaking behaviors. Not legitimate need, but calculated dependency, intended to ensure prioritization of his interests above all others, including my own most basic requirements for autonomy and connection beyond our isolated unit. This recognition didn't immediately translate to decisive action. The confrontation with evidence, both his manipulation and my compliance, had begun, but its resolution remained distant. The patterns established over years couldn't be dismantled in days or weeks. The programming that had led me to miss my own mother's funeral for his convenience wouldn't be rewritten through single instances of boundary enforcement or momentary clarity about dysfunctional dynamics. But something had shifted, however slightly. A crack had appeared in the foundation of justifications that had supported years of self-diminishment. A question had emerged that couldn't be easily dismissed or rationalized away. If I could miss my mother's funeral for someone who didn't even acknowledge the magnitude of that sacrifice, what other essential parts of myself might I surrender before recognizing the true cost of this relationship? Grief comes in layers, the surface pain that everyone can see and acknowledge, the deeper anguish that close friends might recognize, and beneath that, the subterranean currents that remain largely invisible even to those who love us most, the private reckonings that reshape our internal landscape in ways we struggle to articulate even to ourselves. The emotional aftermath of missing my mother's funeral existed at all these levels simultaneously. The public grief, socially acceptable mourning for a parent lost too soon to aggressive disease. The private anguish, not just of loss but of absence during crucial final moments, of witnessing her funeral through the sterile distance of a smartphone screen. And the deepest, most transformative layer, the recognition that I had violated something fundamental in myself, had crossed a boundary I hadn't even known existed until I was already on the other side, irretrievably separated from the person I had once believed myself to be. The initial emotional response wasn't dramatic collapse but fractured functionality. I continued working, maintained the relationship with Daniel, performed the basic requirements of daily existence. Externally, I appeared to be processing normal grief, perhaps complicated by guilt about my absence but fundamentally recognizable as standard bereavement. Inside, something far more complex was unfolding, not just mourning for my mother, but mourning for the daughter I had failed to be in her final moments. Not just sadness over her death, but horror at my own capacity for self-betrayal. The grief counselor I eventually consulted, without telling Daniel, scheduling appointments during lunch breaks to avoid explaining their purpose, identified this as complicated grief with moral injury. Not just the pain of loss, but the deeper wound of having violated core values in ways that fractured fundamental self-concept. Not just mourning an external absence, but grieving an internal betrayal that called into question my entire understanding of who I was and what I was capable of becoming. This moral injury manifested in unexpected ways. Dreams where I searched desperately for the funeral location, running through unfamiliar streets with increasing panic, always arriving to find an empty chapel and a closed casket. Physical reactions to certain triggers, nausea when seeing mothers and daughters together in public places, sudden tears when hearing specific songs that had been family favorites, panic attacks when airport announcements reminded me of the flight back I never took in time. Intrusive thoughts that arrived without warning, imagining my mother's last conscious moments, wondering if she had asked for me, creating scenarios where she died believing I had abandoned her despite my sister's assurance that she had remained supportive until the end. The most persistent manifestation was a peculiar form of disassociation, the sensation of watching myself perform the routines of daily life without genuine connection to them, observing my continued accommodation of Daniel's needs without fully inhabiting the choices, seeing myself maintain the relationship without emotionally investing in it. A psychological distance from my own actions that simultaneously protected me from their full implications and prevented any authentic processing of what they signified. This detachment extended beyond the relationship to other aspects of life. Work became mechanical execution of required tasks without creative engagement. Friendships, already eroded by years of canceled plans and divided attention, withered further as I withdrew from meaningful connection. Even basic physical self-care deteriorated. Eating became functional rather than pleasurable. Sleep arrived as exhaustion rather than natural rhythm. Exercise existed only as minimal maintenance when lower energy levels threatened basic functionality. The most painful emotional fallout involved my relationship with my remaining family, not just the immediate aftermath of the funeral, but the ongoing damage to connections already strained by years of prioritizing Daniel's demands. My father's careful neutrality, never directly criticizing my choices but subtly withdrawing from previous closeness. My sister's more explicit distance, returning to her life across the country with decreased communication and perfunctory responses when contact did occur. The extended family's polite but meaningful exclusion, invitations to subsequent gatherings arriving late or not at all, conversations during inevitable holiday encounters remaining surface level and brief. Against this backdrop of loss and disconnection, the relationship with Daniel continued, not because of passionate commitment but through emotional inertia. The patterns were too established, the programming too thorough for immediate disruption despite growing awareness of their destructive nature. Like continuing to inhabit a house while gradually recognizing its structural damage, uncomfortable but temporarily easier than facing the full magnitude of what rebuilding would require. The relationship dynamic itself shifted subtly following my first significant boundary enforcement. The weekend I maintained my commitment to visit my father despite Daniel's manufactured emergency. Not dramatic confrontation or explicit power struggle, but incremental adjustments on both sides. His manipulative tactics became simultaneously more obvious and more refined. My compliance remained habitual but increasingly conscious, the automatic responses now accompanied by awareness of their voluntary nature. This growing consciousness created its own emotional complications. No longer able to frame my choices as inevitable responses to legitimate needs, I had to confront my active participation in my own diminishment. No longer capable of viewing the relationship as reciprocal exchange distorted by temporary circumstances, I had to acknowledge its fundamentally extractive nature. No longer permitted the comfort of believing myself helplessly entangled, I had to recognize my continued presence as deliberate choice rather than inescapable necessity. This recognition carried its own emotional burden, not just guilt about past choices but responsibility for present ones. Not just regret over what had already occurred but accountability for what continued to unfold. Not just shame about having missed my mother's funeral, but the more complex reckoning with still maintaining the relationship that had facilitated that absence. 6 months after my mother's death, I found myself in my childhood bedroom during a rare weekend visit home, sorting through boxes my father had gathered of her personal belongings. Buried among photographs and journals was a card I had given her for Mother's Day 5 years earlier, before Daniel, before the gradual erosion of boundaries, before the systematic redirection of attention and energy away from family toward his insatiable needs. The handwritten message inside carried unintentional prophecy. Thank you for showing me what real love looks like, the kind that supports without smothering, encourages without demanding, and always wants the recipient to become more fully themselves rather than a reflection of someone else's needs. Words written in a different lifetime, by a different version of myself, someone who recognized healthy love in theory but would prove incapable of maintaining it in practice. Finding this card triggered the first genuine emotional breakdown since the funeral itself. Not quiet tears or momentary distress, but comprehensive collapse, sobbing that came from somewhere beyond conscious control, physical shaking that felt like the body's attempt to dislodge something foreign that had taken root within it, sounds that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. My father found me there, curled around the card, as if physically protecting the truth it contained from the reality I had created in its absence. His response wasn't accusation or judgment, but simple presence. Sitting beside me on the floor, hand resting lightly on my shoulder, waiting without expectation until the storm gradually subsided. When I finally looked up, his expression held no triumph at this confirmation of what he had likely suspected, that my absence from his wife's funeral hadn't represented necessary response to legitimate emergency, but voluntary surrender to manipulative demand. Just sadness, recognition, and what appeared to be cautious hope that this breakdown might represent the beginning of something, rather than just the acknowledgement of what had already been lost. She would want you back, he said finally, not elaborate declaration or emotional manipulation, but simple truth offered without demand for immediate response or specific action. Just observation gently placed between us, available for consideration when I became capable of receiving it. This moment marked the beginning of emotional reintegration, not dramatic healing but incremental reconnection with feelings that had been systematically suppressed and compartmentalized. Not instantaneous transformation, but gradual reawakening to emotional experiences beyond the limited range permitted within the relationship with Daniel. Not complete recovery, but tentative steps toward authentic engagement with internal reality rather than continued detachment from it. The process unfolded unevenly over subsequent months, periods of increased awareness followed by retreat into familiar patterns, moments of clarity about the relationship's destructive nature interrupted by recommitment to its continuation. Incremental boundary assertions followed by automatic surrenders to established dynamics, the emotional landscape resembling psychological trench warfare, territory gained and lost repeatedly in slow, exhausting progression toward uncertain resolution. Throughout this period, Daniel remained remarkably consistent, adapting tactics to changing circumstances but maintaining unchanging strategic objectives. His needs remained paramount, his crises providentially timed, his emotional stability perpetually dependent on my continuous management and support. The manipulative methods evolved in response to my emerging boundaries, but the fundamental extraction dynamic persisted without meaningful alteration. 9 months after my mother's funeral, I experienced the emotional fallout's most unexpected manifestation: gratitude, not for Daniel's manipulation or my own complicity in it, but for the unveiled reality their combined influence had eventually produced. Not celebration of having missed my mother's funeral, but appreciation for the clarity that devastating choice ultimately forced. Not justification for the relationship's continuation, but recognition that its existence had finally revealed aspects of myself requiring acknowledgement and address if any healthier connection were ever to become possible. This gratitude emerged not as comfortable emotion but necessary recognition. The relationship with Daniel, destructive as it had become, had exposed psychological patterns I might otherwise have maintained without conscious awareness. The progressive boundary violations had eventually revealed internal fragility that would have remained invisible without such comprehensive exploitation. The ultimate sacrifice of missing my mother's funeral had finally forced confrontation with a fundamental question. What would I not surrender in service to someone else's demands? What core self remained beneath the progressive erasure of boundaries and independent identity? Most profound emotional fallout wasn't dramatic suffering, but quiet revolution, the gradual reclamation of internal territory that had been systematically surrendered over years of incremental boundary violation. Not instantaneous liberation, but progressive reestablishment of connection with values, needs, and identity that had been subordinated to relationship maintenance. Not complete healing, but incremental movement toward authentic engagement with both internal and external reality. This revolution occurred beneath the relationship's visible surface, interior shifts that preceded external action, private reckonings that would eventually enable public choices. The emotional processing that happened without Daniel's knowledge or participation. The gradual reconnection with fundamental values that his influence had systematically undermined. The quiet rebuilding of psychological infrastructure necessary to eventually support significant change. A year after my mother's death, I visited her grave for the first time, alone, without announcement to either Daniel or my family. The simple headstone, selected by my father and sister during the funeral planning I had missed, bore only her name, dates, and the simple inscription, "Love Remains." Kneeling on the recently thawed spring ground, I finally allowed myself to fully feel what I had been avoiding since receiving the call about her diagnosis. Not just grief over her absence, but rage at the circumstances of our final separation. Not just sadness about natural death, but fury about unnecessary disconnection. Not just mourning for her loss, but righteous anger at the relationship that had facilitated my absence during her final days, and the funeral that should have represented my last opportunity for formal farewell. This anger wasn't comfortable or socially acceptable, didn't conform to standard grieving patterns or conventional emotional responses, violated cultural expectations about appropriate bereavement and acceptable emotional expression, but its emergence represented crucial psychological development, the recovery of authentic emotional response after years of progressive suppression and redirection. The anger wasn't directed primarily at Daniel, though his manipulation had certainly facilitated the circumstances that prompted it. The most intense fury focused inward, at my own willingness to sacrifice fundamental values for external validation, my own participation in progressive self-erasure, my own surrender of essential integrity for illusory connection. This self-directed anger, uncomfortable as it remained, provided essential emotional energy for what would eventually follow. Not destructive self-hatred, but motivating self-recognition. Not paralysis-inducing shame, but activation-generating accountability. Not backward-facing recrimination, but forward-directed determination that such fundamental self-betrayal would not be repeated regardless of external pressure or circumstantial justification. Sitting beside my mother's grave, I made the first promise I had any genuine intention of keeping since her diagnosis. Not that I would leave Daniel immediately or transform overnight, but that I would begin the process of reclaiming whatever remained of the daughter she had raised and loved, the person who once understood that real love supports without smothering, encourages without demanding, and always wants the recipient to become more fully themselves rather than a reflection of someone else's needs. Transformation rarely happens in a single, dramatic moment. Real change accumulates gradually through small decisions, incremental boundary enforcements, and quiet revolutions of perspective that eventually reach critical mass. But sometimes these accumulated shifts crystallize in a specific incident, not the cause of change but its catalyst, not the beginning of awareness, but the moment when awareness finally translates into decisive action. For me, that crystallization occurred 14 months after my mother's death, not during an extraordinary crisis or dramatic confrontation, but in an utterly mundane moment that somehow contained the entirety of the relationship's dysfunction within its seemingly insignificant boundaries. I had been slowly reclaiming small territories of independence in the months since visiting my mother's grave, reestablishing minimal contact with friends who had been systematically excluded from my life, taking on work projects that required occasional travel despite Daniel's inevitable emergencies, timed to coincide with planned absences, making weekly phone calls to my father regardless of competing demands. Small acts of boundary maintenance that represented neither complete liberation nor continued capitulation, but incremental movement toward eventual resolution. Daniel had adapted to these changes as he always did, not with direct opposition, but with strategic adjustment. The emotional crises became more dramatically presented to compensate for their decreased effectiveness. The business emergencies acquired greater urgency to overcome my growing resistance. The fundamental dynamic remained unchanged, even as its specific manifestations evolved in response to emerging boundaries. The turning point arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I had made plans to attend my cousin's photography exhibition, a modest commitment to family reconnection after months of gradual rapprochement following my extended absence. Nothing dramatic or extraordinary, just small step toward repairing relationships damaged by years of progressive isolation and the ultimate betrayal of missing my mother's funeral. 3 hours before the exhibition, Daniel called with the latest manufactured emergency, a potential investor suddenly available for dinner, requiring my presence for optimal impression management. The timing wasn't coincidental. He had known about my plans for weeks, had initially expressed support for this family reconnection, had seemingly accepted this minor deviation from complete availability. The crisis followed familiar choreography, reasonable initial request escalating to emotional urgency when met with resistance. The strategic deployment of phrases that had reliably produced compliance in the past, the carefully calculated progression from request to expectation to implicit demand, the unstated but clearly communicated message. My availability remained non-negotiable despite superficial acceptance of emerging independence. What made this ordinary manipulation the turning point wasn't its nature but my response to it. Not dramatic confrontation or explosive rejection, but something quieter yet more definitive, complete clarity about what was actually happening. Not emotional reaction but calm recognition. Not hurt or anger but simple acknowledgement of patterns previously rationalized or ignored. I could see with perfect clarity how this crisis had been manufactured to test recently established boundaries. Could recognize without emotion how this particular moment had been selected for maximum impact, family obligation carrying implicit connection to the most significant boundary violation in our relationship's history. Could observe without distress the carefully calibrated manipulation designed to determine whether my incremental movements toward independence could be reversed through established control tactics. This clarity brought neither anger nor despair but something more powerful, certainty. Not emotional conviction but quiet knowledge, not desperate determination but settled recognition that the relationship as it existed could not continue regardless of potential consequences. Not dramatic decision but simple acknowledgement of reality that had existed for months beneath progressively thinning layers of justification and rationalization. My response wasn't emotional or confrontational, no accusations or dramatic declarations, just simple statement that I had existing plans I intended to maintain. No elaborate explanation or defensive justification. No engagement with escalating emotional manipulation or increasingly dramatic consequences predicted. Just calm reiteration of unavailability for this particular request regardless of its framing as emergency or opportunity. Daniel's reaction followed predictable progression, reasonable disappointment escalating to wounded disbelief, strategic vulnerability, transforming into implied accusations of betrayal, performed helplessness evolving into explicit consequences if support was withheld at this critical juncture. The familiar emotional choreography designed to trigger caretaking responses and boundary surrender that had reliably produced desired outcomes throughout our relationship's history. For the first time, I observed this progression without emotional engagement, could see its deliberate nature and strategic deployment, could recognize its calculated escalation and intentional manipulation, could acknowledge its fundamental purpose, not genuine expression of legitimate need, but tactical maneuver designed to maintain established control dynamics despite emerging resistance. I attended my cousin's exhibition as planned, maintained family connection despite predictable consequences, prioritized existing commitment above manufactured emergency without elaborate justification or explanation, simple boundary maintenance rather than dramatic declaration of independence. Throughout the evening, Daniel's texts arrived with increasing urgency and emotional intensity, each message designed to penetrate emerging boundaries through escalating consequences and amplifying emotional manipulation. Each communication strategically crafted to trigger established responses of guilt, responsibility, and reflexive caretaking, regardless of competing commitments or personal needs. For the first time, these messages produced no emotional response, no automatic anxiety or reflexive guilt, no divided attention or psychological presence elsewhere while physically attending the current event, just calm acknowledgement of manipulation without corresponding emotional engagement or behavioral compliance. Returning home after the exhibition, I found exactly what experience had taught me to expect: strategic emotional withdrawal combined with passive-aggressive indicators of displeasure. The silent treatment designed to prompt anxious reconnection attempts. The exaggerated physical indicators of emotional distress positioned to trigger caretaking responses. The carefully arranged environmental cues suggesting crisis endured without requested support. In previous cycles, these tactics would have produced immediate capitulation, apologies for unavailability, excessive compensation for boundary maintenance, redoubled efforts to repair relationship damage presumed to result from ordinary independence. The established pattern of boundary enforcement followed by boundary surrender, independence assertion followed by intensified dependence. This time something fundamental had shifted, not dramatic emotion or explicit recognition, but quiet certainty about what could no longer continue regardless of potential consequences or relationship implications. Not reactive decision, but settled acknowledgement of reality that had existed beneath progressive awareness for months without corresponding action. I prepared for bed without engaging with displayed emotional distress or responding to performed rejection. Maintained normal routine despite tactical provocations designed to trigger established response patterns. Proceeded through ordinary evening activities without acknowledging manipulative dynamics or attempting to address their underlying purpose. Daniel's eventual escalation followed predictable progression, wounded silence transforming into explicit accusation, passive resistance evolving into active confrontation, strategic withdrawal converting to direct engagement when initial tactics proved ineffective. The fundamental question finally presented directly rather than implied through manipulative behavior. Did I understand what was at stake if this pattern of independence continued? My response wasn't emotional or dramatic, no accusations about manipulation or exploitation, no references to historical patterns or significant boundary violations, no mention of missed funeral or subsequent absence of gratitude or acknowledgement, just quiet confirmation that I understood potential consequences but intended to maintain appropriate boundaries regardless of projected outcomes or relationship implications. Daniel's reaction to this unprecedented resistance revealed what had always existed beneath strategic vulnerability and performed helplessness, calculated control masked as emotional need, not genuine distress but tactical deployment of emotional leverage, not authentic vulnerability but manufactured fragility designed to ensure continued compliance and resource extraction. The confrontation that followed wasn't explosive or dramatic, no shouting or physical intimidation, no explicit threats or direct ultimatums, just progressively transparent manipulation as established tactics failed to produce familiar compliance. The gradual revelation of underlying control mechanisms as their effectiveness diminished through conscious recognition and deliberate non-engagement. 3 weeks after the photography exhibition that catalyzed this fundamental shift, Daniel finally deployed what experience had taught him represented guaranteed compliance trigger. Medical emergency requiring immediate support and complete attention, regardless of competing obligations or existing boundaries. The strategic illness carefully calibrated to maximize guilt and caretaking response, without creating verifiable symptoms or necessitating external intervention that might reveal its manufactured nature. In previous cycles, this nuclear option had reliably produced immediate capitulation, regardless of preceding boundary establishment or independence assertion. The automatic surrender of emerging autonomy when faced with potential medical consequences or implied health crisis. The reflexive abandonment of personal needs when confronted with apparent physical vulnerability, regardless of suspicious timing or convenient manifestation. This time, something fundamental had changed. Not emotional detachment or deliberate cruelty, but quiet certainty about manipulation that could no longer be ignored regardless of its strategic presentation or tactical effectiveness. Not coldness or indifference, but clear recognition of patterns previously rationalized or minimized, despite their increasingly transparent nature and explicitly exploitative purpose. My response wasn't dramatic rejection or explicit disbelief. No accusations of manufactured crisis or manipulative intent. Just calm suggestion of appropriate medical intervention rather than relational caretaking. The recommendation of professional assessment rather than amateur diagnosis and treatment. The advocacy for proper health care rather than psychological management and emotional support without corresponding medical expertise or clinical training. Daniel's reaction to this unprecedented response revealed what had always existed beneath strategic illness and performed vulnerability, deliberate manipulation masked as legitimate need. The immediate recovery when specialized medical attention was proposed rather than relationship intensification and boundary suspension. The rapid symptom resolution when professional intervention threatened to reveal manufactured nature of conveniently timed crisis. This transparent manipulation crystallized what gradual awareness had been building toward for months: complete clarity about relationship that could no longer continue regardless of historical investment or potential consequences. Not emotional decision, but settled recognition of reality that had existed beneath progressively thinning layers of justification and rationalization throughout relationships' extended history. That evening, I packed essential belongings while Daniel was meeting potential investors, another convenient emergency that had materialized when previous manipulation tactics proved ineffective. Left note with simple explanation of departure, without elaborate justification or emotional declaration. Arranged temporary accommodation without dramatic announcement or public relationship termination. Quiet exit rather than explosive separation after years of progressive boundary violation, culminating in ultimate sacrifice that finally forced recognition of fundamental incompatibility between authentic selfhood and relationship continuation. The turning point wasn't dramatic realization or emotional epiphany, but quiet certainty that finally translated awareness into action after months of incremental boundary establishment and progressive recognition. Not sudden transformation, but culmination of gradual evolution from automatic compliance to conscious resistance despite escalating manipulation and intensifying consequences. I had missed my mother's funeral for him, and he hadn't even said thank you. This simple truth had finally penetrated layers of justification and rationalization to reveal relationships' fundamental nature regardless of external presentation or subjective experience. Not dramatic catalyst, but quiet recognition that eventually reached critical mass through accumulated awareness and progressive clarity despite established patterns and deeply programmed responses. The apartment I found 3 weeks after leaving Daniel was a furnished studio in a neighborhood I'd never considered before, too far from his office, too small for entertaining, too anonymous for the life we'd constructed together. It was perfect precisely because it represented everything our shared existence had systematically excluded: solitude, simplicity, and the strange luxury of making decisions based solely on my own preferences without considering their impact on someone else's emotional equilibrium. The early days of separation weren't dramatic or cathartic, no sense of liberation or relief, just the peculiar disorientation of inhabiting my own life after years of existing as supporting character in someone else's narrative. The silence felt oppressive at first, no constant text notifications requiring immediate response, no emotional crises demanding instant management, no perpetual low-level anxiety about potential emergencies that might require immediate availability. The absence of chaos registering as emptiness rather than peace. Sleep came differently in that first month, not the exhausted collapse that had characterized my nights with Daniel, mental energy depleted by constant emotional management, but the slow, unfamiliar settling into rest without hypervigilance. No phone beside the bed monitoring for midnight emergencies. No half-conscious alertness for subtle changes in breathing or movement that might signal impending crisis requiring immediate intervention. Just the gradual recognition that my nervous system had been locked in survival mode for so long that relaxation felt suspicious rather than restorative. The most immediate long-term consequence wasn't emotional or psychological but practical: rebuilding basic life infrastructure that had been systematically dismantled to accommodate Daniel's needs. Simple tasks that had once been automatic: grocery shopping without consulting someone else's preferences, choosing weekend activities based on personal interest rather than another's availability, making social plans without pre-approval or extensive justification, felt foreign after years of collaborative decision-making that had actually been disguised submission. My father noticed the change during our first phone conversation after the separation. Not dramatic transformation, but subtle shift in vocal quality, less monitoring of background for potential interruptions, less divided attention between his words and possible texts requiring immediate response, less apologetic tone when discussing personal activities or preferences. He didn't comment directly, but the conversation lasted longer than any had in years, meandering through topics without rushed conclusions or abrupt endings prompted by competing demands. "You sound like yourself again," he said finally, not accusatory but observational. The woman who had called him regularly before Daniel, who had engaged fully in conversations without electronic distraction, who had possessed opinions and preferences not filtered through someone else's needs or emotional reactions. The daughter who had existed before learning to sublimate her identity in service of someone else's perpetual crisis management. This observation catalyzed recognition of how comprehensively I had disappeared into the relationship without conscious awareness of the progressive erasure. Not dramatic loss but gradual diminishment, interests abandoned when they generated no enthusiasm from Daniel, friendships allowed to atrophy when they required time away from his needs, professional ambitions scaled back to accommodate the emotional labor his lifestyle demanded. Death by 1,000 small accommodations, each reasonable in isolation, but collectively representing complete identity surrender. The career consequences became apparent within months of separation. Not immediate crisis, but gradual recognition of opportunities foregone, advancement delayed, professional relationships neglected during years of prioritizing Daniel's business emergencies over my own career development. The projects declined because they required travel that might interfere with my availability. The networking events skipped because they coincided with his emotional crises. The leadership roles avoided because they carried responsibilities incompatible with being constantly available for another person's psychological maintenance. My supervisor at the design agency, a woman whose direct communication style had sometimes irritated me during the Daniel years, requested a private meeting 6 weeks after my separation. Her feedback was professional but pointed. My work quality had been excellent throughout my tenure, but my availability and engagement had been inconsistent in ways that had limited advancement opportunities. Not criticism, but clarification that improvement in these areas would open possibilities previously unavailable due to perceived reliability concerns. The conversation was uncomfortable but illuminating. External confirmation that my professional reputation had suffered during years when I believed I was successfully balancing relationship demands with career obligations. Recognition that colleagues had noticed patterns I had rationalized or minimized. Acknowledgement that rebuilding professional standing would require consistent demonstration of commitment beyond technical competency. The social consequences proved more complex than anticipated. Friendships I had assumed were dormant rather than destroyed required delicate negotiation to reestablish. Some connections had survived the years of canceled plans and divided attention, friends understanding enough to recognize unhealthy relationship dynamics even when I couldn't articulate them myself. Others had moved on completely, natural life changes accelerated by my systematic unavailability during significant events and transitions. My college roommate Sarah, someone I had been close to before Daniel but had seen perhaps 5 times in 3 years, agreed to coffee with obvious hesitation. Her guardedness wasn't personal rejection but appropriate boundary establishment with someone who had repeatedly demonstrated that other obligations would supersede friendship when conflicts arose. The conversation was polite but careful, both of us navigating around the changed dynamic without explicitly acknowledging its cause. "I'm glad you seem to be doing better," she said finally, not asking for details but creating space for disclosure if offered. The kindness beneath the caution was evident, willingness to reconnect if I could demonstrate reliable presence, understanding that previous patterns couldn't simply be forgotten without evidence of meaningful change. These interactions revealed the long-term consequence I hadn't anticipated, earning back trust I hadn't realized I'd lost. Not dramatic rejection, but justified caution from people who had accommodated my relationship dynamics longer than they should have before protecting themselves from repeated disappointment. The recognition that rebuilding social connections would require consistent demonstration of change rather than simple explanation of circumstances. The financial consequences were subtler but significant. Years of sharing expenses with Daniel, his business costs absorbed into our household budget as temporary measures during funding gaps, my resources redirected to support his enterprises rather than building personal financial security, had left me less prepared for independent living than I should have been at 31. Not poverty but substantially reduced cushion for managing transition, rebuilding credit independently, and reestablishing financial autonomy after years of increasingly merged economic decisions. The psychological consequences manifested in unexpected ways. Not relief at escaping manipulation but confusion about identity without constant crisis management to provide purpose. Who was I when not responding to someone else's needs? What did I enjoy when not filtering preferences through another person's reactions? How did I spend time when not anticipating interruptions requiring immediate attention redirection? These questions weren't immediately answerable. The woman who had existed before Daniel seemed foreign after years of progressive adaptation to his requirements. The interests and preferences I remembered having felt authentic but distant, like recalled dreams rather than present reality. The process of rediscovering autonomous identity proved more challenging than simply removing myself from manipulative relationship dynamics. Therapy became necessary 6 months after separation when the disorientation hadn't resolved into clarity. Not dramatic breakdown, but persistent difficulty making independent decisions, establishing personal preferences, and engaging authentically with others without constantly monitoring for signs of potential conflict or disapproval. The recognition that healing from manipulation requires more than physical separation. It demands psychological reconstruction of selfhood that had been systematically undermined. The therapist specialized in what she termed relationship trauma, not dramatic abuse, but the cumulative impact of systematic boundary erosion and identity suppression within apparently loving partnerships. Her framework provided context for experiences I had struggled to name: the hypervigilance about others' emotional states, the automatic assumption of responsibility for conflicts or disappointments, the difficulty distinguishing between reasonable reciprocity and exploitative extraction in relationship dynamics. You learn to exist as an extension of someone else rather than an independent person, she explained during our third session. The challenge isn't just leaving that relationship, but remembering how to be a complete person rather than half of a dysfunctional partnership. This process unfolded over months of weekly sessions, gradually untangling behavioral patterns that had become automatic during the Daniel years. The reflexive apology for expressing preferences, the immediate assumption that others' problems required my active intervention, the persistent monitoring of emotional environment to prevent conflicts that might require management, the automatic subordination of personal needs when they competed with external demands. One of the most persistent long-term consequences involved my relationship with family, particularly the grief process I had never completed regarding my mother's death. The guilt over missing her funeral had been complicated by years of justifying that absence rather than processing its emotional impact. The anger at Daniel's manipulation had been easier to access than the deeper rage at myself for allowing something so fundamental to be sacrificed for relationship maintenance. Visiting my mother's grave became a monthly ritual 18 months after separation, not morbid fixation but gradual reconnection with grief that had been compartmentalized rather than processed. Each visit permitted deeper acknowledgement of what had been lost, not just her death but the opportunity for meaningful farewell, the chance to be present during her final days, the simple dignity of attending my own mother's funeral without justification or explanation. My sister maintained careful distance throughout this period, not rejection but appropriate protection of her own emotional well-being after years of disappointment and the ultimate betrayal of my absence during our mother's final moments. Her Christmas card that first year after separation contained no personal message, just signature without commentary. Polite acknowledgement rather than warm connection, appropriate response to someone still proving their reliability through actions rather than promises. The relationship with my father remained the most successfully reconstructed. His grief at losing his wife of 43 years was profound, but uncomplicated by resentment or disappointment. Our weekly phone calls, maintained consistently regardless of competing demands, gradually reestablished the connection that had existed before Daniel. His patient presence during my own grief process provided stability without expectation of dramatic healing or immediate resolution. "Your mother would be proud of the choice you made," he said during one of our conversations, not absolving my absence from her funeral, but acknowledging the courage required to leave the relationship that had facilitated it. She always believed people could change when they were ready to see clearly. The most unexpected long-term consequence was discovering aspects of myself that had been suppressed during the relationship years, creative interests that had been abandoned when they generated no enthusiasm from Daniel, physical activities that had been discontinued when they required time away from his needs, social preferences that had been overridden by his comfort requirements. Not dramatic personality changes, but gradual reclamation of authentic identity that had existed before learning to define myself primarily through service to another person's requirements. 2 years after separation, I enrolled in a weekend photography workshop, the first purely personal interest I had pursued since college. The decision required no consultation, generated no anxiety about conflicting obligations, created no concern about someone else's reaction to my absence. Simple choice based on personal curiosity, enabled by recovered autonomy and financial independence that had been gradually rebuilding since leaving Daniel. The workshop itself was unremarkable: basic technique instruction and practice sessions in local parks and urban environments. What proved significant was the complete mental presence it permitted, the full engagement with a learning experience without divided attention or background monitoring for potential crises requiring immediate intervention. The luxury of pursuing interest for its own sake rather than as component of complex emotional management system. This small reclamation of autonomous activity represented broader recovery patterns. Not dramatic transformation, but incremental reestablishment of independent identity through accumulated choices and recovered preferences. The recognition that healing from manipulative relationship involves not just removing oneself from harmful dynamics, but actively rebuilding the selfhood that had been systematically undermined through years of progressive accommodation and boundary erosion. 3 years after leaving Daniel, the long-term consequences had stabilized into integrated rather than ongoing adaptation. The financial situation had improved through consistent career focus without competing demands for attention and resources. Professional relationships had been reestablished through reliable engagement and sustained presence. Social connections had been gradually rebuilt through demonstrated change rather than explained circumstances. The psychological consequences required ongoing management rather than complete resolution. Hypervigilance about relationship dynamics remained elevated but focused rather than generalized. Decision-making had improved but still required conscious attention to avoid automatic deferral to others' preferences. Identity expression felt authentic but required periodic reinforcement rather than existing automatically. The most persistent long-term consequence involved my approach to romantic relationships. Not complete avoidance, but heightened awareness of early warning signs that might indicate manipulative tendencies or boundary-testing behaviors. The recognition that love should enhance rather than diminish sense of self, support rather than exploit natural generosity, encourage rather than systematically undermine independent identity and autonomous decision-making. This awareness didn't prevent connection, but ensured healthier selection and more conscious engagement. The understanding that genuine partnership required reciprocity rather than extraction, mutual support rather than systematic caretaking, balanced consideration rather than automatic subordination of needs and preferences to maintain relationship stability through conflict avoidance and boundary surrender. Standing in my own apartment, no longer temporary housing but conscious choice about environment that reflected personal preferences rather than shared compromise, the long-term consequences felt less like permanent damage than expensive education. Not just about manipulation and boundary violation, but about the fundamental requirements for authentic relationship. Mutual respect, reciprocal consideration, and the understanding that real love supports rather than systematically undermines the complete flourishing of both people involved. I had missed my mother's funeral for him, and he hadn't even said thank you. This truth no longer carried active anger but served as permanent reminder of what I would never sacrifice again, regardless of external pressure or emotional manipulation, designed to override authentic priorities and fundamental values that should remain non-negotiable within any healthy relationship dynamic. 4 years have passed since I left Daniel. 4 years since I walked away from the relationship that cost me my mother's funeral and nearly cost me myself. The woman who types these words barely recognizes the person who once sat in a hotel lobby, watching her mother's memorial service through a pixelated phone screen while waiting for a man to emerge from yet another crucial investor meeting. The current state isn't dramatic transformation or complete healing. Those narratives belong to movies and self-help books that promise neat resolutions to messy human experiences. Instead, it's something quieter but more substantive, the gradual reconstruction of a life built on authentic foundations rather than the shifting sands of someone else's emotional requirements. I live alone now by choice rather than circumstance. The same studio apartment I fled to during those first desperate weeks has evolved into something intentionally mine. Books chosen for personal interest rather than impressive spines, furniture arranged for comfort rather than entertaining potential investors, artwork selected because it moves me rather than because it projects the right image for someone else's professional aspirations. This solitude isn't loneliness or withdrawal but conscious decision to understand who I am when not defined by service to another person's needs. The space provides clarity impossible during years of emotional noise and manufactured crisis. Quiet enough to hear my own thoughts without filtering them through someone else's reactions. Still enough to recognize authentic preferences that emerge without external pressure or manipulation. Work situation has stabilized beyond my most optimistic projections from those early months after separation. The design agency promoted me to creative director 18 months ago, advancement that became possible once I demonstrated consistent availability and sustained focus without competing demands on my attention and energy. Projects that require travel or extended hours no longer trigger anxiety about abandoned obligations or potential consequences for unavailability. My reputation among colleagues has been rebuilt through demonstrated reliability rather than explained circumstances. The woman who once left client meetings for Daniel's emotional emergencies is now the person others turn to for steady judgment and creative problem solving. Not because I've become more talented, but because I'm finally present in my own professional life rather than perpetually distracted by someone else's manufactured crises. Last month, I was offered a position at a prestigious firm in Seattle, opportunity that would have been inconceivable during the Daniel years when geographic mobility was constrained by his business requirements and emotional dependencies. I declined, not from fear of change, but from satisfaction with progress already achieved and relationships being rebuilt here. The luxury of choosing based on authentic preference rather than external obligation or someone else's unstated expectations. The family relationships remain complex but significantly improved. My father and I speak twice weekly now, conversations that meander through topics without rushed conclusions or background monitoring for potential interruptions. He remarried last year, a gentle woman who understands that his children come with complicated histories but doesn't demand detailed explanations or dramatic reconciliation narratives. Their quiet contentment provides evidence that healthy partnerships exist without requiring systematic sacrifice from either participant. My sister remains more cautious in her engagement, understandably protective after years of disappointment culminating in my absence during our mother's most significant farewell. We exchange messages on holidays and family occasions, polite rather than warm but not actively hostile. Her wedding invitation last spring represented tentative olive branch inclusion without expectation, invitation without assumption of automatic attendance or enthusiastic participation. I went to the wedding, flew across the country without checking with anyone else about schedule conflicts or potential consequences for absence, participated fully in family celebration without divided attention or competing obligations, gave a brief toast about sisters who love each other despite making different choices, sometimes learning different lessons at different speeds. Her embrace afterward held forgiveness that didn't require explicit apology or detailed explanation, just recognition that I had become someone capable of showing up when it mattered. The financial situation has evolved from post-separation uncertainty to genuine stability. The combined student loans that once felt overwhelming are manageable now without someone else's business expenses creating competing demands on resources. The retirement account that was depleted during Daniel's funding gaps has been steadily rebuilding. The credit score that suffered during years of merged financial decisions has recovered through consistent independent management. More importantly, financial decisions are mine alone now. No consultation required for purchases beyond basic necessities. No justification needed for career choices based on personal preference rather than flexibility requirements for someone else's schedule. No automatic assumption that resources should be shared without corresponding reciprocity or acknowledgement. The simple autonomy of adult financial management without negotiation or manipulation disguised as collaboration. Dating resumed cautiously 2 years after separation, not from loneliness or social pressure but from genuine readiness to explore connection with another person without losing myself in the process. The men I've met are generally kind, often interesting, occasionally attractive. None have triggered the hypervigilance that characterized my early post-Daniel interactions, when every expression of need or preference felt potentially manipulative. The relationship that developed with Michael, an environmental lawyer I met through mutual friends, lasted 8 months and ended amicably when we recognized fundamental lifestyle incompatibilities. Not dramatic conflict or manipulation, but simple acknowledgement that his desire for adventure travel and spontaneous weekend trips conflicted with my current preference for routine and predictability. Adult conversation about differing needs, without anyone required to sacrifice core preferences for relationship maintenance. The breakup itself provided evidence of healing I hadn't recognized. No automatic assumption that disagreement meant relationship failure requiring immediate repair. No reflexive accommodation of his preferences at the expense of my own stated needs. No guilt about maintaining boundaries that protected my still recovering nervous system from the overstimulation his lifestyle would have created. Just honest assessment of compatibility without emotional manipulation or tactical maneuvering. I've learned to distinguish between compromise, the healthy give and take of equals working toward mutual satisfaction, and capitulation, the systematic subordination of one person's needs to maintain relationship stability through conflict avoidance. Compromise involves both parties adjusting preferences to find workable solutions. Capitulation involves one person perpetually surrendering to prevent the emotional distress that boundary maintenance might trigger in the other. This distinction has proven essential in all relationships, not just romantic ones. Professional interactions where colleagues attempt to transfer their work responsibilities through emotional leverage rather than direct request. Friendships where one person consistently dominates social plans through implied consequences when alternatives are suggested. Family dynamics where guilt is deployed to override stated boundaries or manipulate attendance at events inconvenient for everyone except the person issuing demands. The hypervigilance remains but has been refined rather than eliminated, not generalized suspicion of all emotional expression but specific awareness of patterns that indicate potential manipulation. The timing of crises relative to important events, the escalation of emotional intensity when initial requests meet resistance, the strategic deployment of vulnerability to override stated boundaries or extract resources without corresponding reciprocity. These observations don't prevent connection but ensure healthier selection and more conscious engagement. The understanding that people who genuinely care about your well-being don't systematically undermine your ability to maintain relationships with others. That authentic love supports rather than exploits natural generosity. That healthy partnerships enhance rather than diminish sense of self and autonomous decision-making capacity. Therapy continues monthly rather than weekly, maintenance rather than crisis intervention. The sessions focus on ongoing pattern recognition and response refinement rather than processing acute trauma from the Daniel years. How to engage authentically without automatic emotional management of others' reactions. How to express preferences clearly without apologetic justification or defensive explanation. How to maintain appropriate boundaries without isolating protective measures that prevent genuine intimacy. Dr. Martinez, the therapist who helped navigate the early reconstruction period, recently observed that my progress had stabilized into integration rather than ongoing recovery. "You're no longer healing from the relationship with Daniel," she said during our last session. "You're just living your life with the wisdom that experience provided." This distinction feels accurate. The acute pain has resolved into useful awareness. The overwhelming guilt has processed into appropriate accountability without destructive self-blame. The rage at manipulation has evolved into determination to recognize and resist similar patterns without becoming cynical about human connection generally. The grief over my mother remains but has found appropriate proportion within broader life experience. I visit her grave monthly, bringing flowers I choose based on seasonal availability rather than symbolic meaning. The conversations are simpler now, updates about work progression and relationship developments rather than elaborate apologies for choices that can't be changed. Acknowledgement of love that existed before Daniel and continues beyond his influence. I've begun volunteering with a local organization that provides support for women leaving emotionally abusive relationships. Not dramatic advocacy or public speaking, but practical assistance with resume development and interview preparation, professional skills that help others rebuild career foundations often damaged by years of systematic availability restrictions and emotional crisis management. Work is quietly satisfying without being emotionally triggering, helping others recognize professional potential that may have been suppressed during relationship years, providing practical tools for financial independence that don't require dramatic personal disclosure or detailed explanation of circumstances that led to career interruption or professional reputation damage. Small contributions that support others' autonomy without requiring my own emotional investment in their specific outcomes. The most significant current state development has been recognizing aspects of myself that existed before Daniel, but had been forgotten rather than simply suppressed. Creative interests that predated the relationship and can be reclaimed without triggering association with loss or manipulation. Professional ambitions that originated in authentic preference rather than reaction to external pressure. Personal values that remained consistent even when their expression was systematically undermined. Photography has become more than weekend hobby, genuine passion that provides creative outlet independent of external validation or approval. The darkroom I set up in the apartment's converted closet requires no one else's permission or accommodation. The weekend trips to capture landscapes or urban details happen without consultation about competing obligations or potential consequences for absence. The portfolio I've been developing over the past year represents work chosen purely for personal satisfaction rather than commercial viability or impressive presentation. Images that reflect my developing eye rather than calculated appeal to specific audience. Creative expression that exists for its own sake rather than as component of complex emotional management system or relationship maintenance strategy. Current romantic prospects are evaluated through different criteria than would have applied during my pre-Daniel years. Not just attraction and compatibility, but demonstrated respect for boundaries and reciprocal consideration of preferences. Evidence of emotional self-regulation rather than external management requirements. capacity for authentic independence rather than strategic dependency disguised as intimate connection. These requirements aren't impossible standards that prevent relationship formation, but appropriate filters that ensure healthier selection. The recognition that settling for less than genuine mutual respect inevitably leads to progressive boundary erosion and identity suppression. That loneliness is preferable to relationship dynamics that require systematic self-diminishment for maintenance. The current state includes acceptance that some relationships may never fully recover from damage done during the Daniel years. Friends who moved on appropriately when I became consistently unavailable. Professional opportunities that were foreclosed by reputation, damaged during years of divided attention and unreliable presence. Family connections that remain cautious due to justified concern about repeated disappointment. This acceptance doesn't include shame or regret that paralyzes forward movement, just honest acknowledgement of choices that created consequences extending beyond the relationship that motivated them. Responsibility for my own decisions without assumption of blame for manipulation that targeted normal human desires for connection and meaning. Accountability for my actions without accepting culpability for someone else's deliberate exploitation of natural vulnerabilities. Standing in my apartment 4 years after leaving Daniel, surrounded by life rebuilt on authentic foundations rather than someone else's requirements, the current state feels both ordinary and miraculous. Not dramatic transformation but quiet revolution, the simple miracle of inhabiting my own existence without apology or explanation. I have a job I enjoy, relationships that nourish rather than deplete, creative outlets that provide genuine satisfaction. No daily crisis management or emotional labor beyond normal human reciprocity. No hypervigilance about potential emergencies that might require immediate availability. No systematic subordination of authentic preferences to maintain relationship stability through conflict avoidance. Most importantly, I have the unshakable knowledge that I will never again miss something irreplaceable for someone who doesn't even acknowledge the magnitude of such sacrifice. The current state includes this certainty not as bitter protection, but as quiet strength, the fundamental understanding that real love supports rather than systematically undermines the people it claims to cherish. I missed my mother's funeral for him, and he didn't even say thank you. This truth no longer carries active pain, but serves as permanent reminder of what authentic love looks like through contrast with its absence. The current state includes this knowledge not as limitation, but as foundation for whatever relationships may develop from this moment forward, built on mutual respect rather than systematic extraction, enhanced understanding rather than progressive diminishment, genuine reciprocity rather than disguised manipulation. The woman who writes these words is not the same person who once sacrificed her mother's funeral for a manufactured emergency. But she's also not entirely different, still capable of deep love and generous support, just with better boundaries and clearer understanding of what those offerings should never require or cost. I keep my mother's memorial program in the drawer next to my bed, alongside the unused boarding pass from the return flight I never took. 2 pieces of paper that document the choice that changed everything, not just the relationship with Daniel, but my understanding of what I'm capable of sacrificing and what I'm willing to become in service to someone else's needs. 5 years later, these artifacts don't trigger the same visceral reaction they once did. No immediate nausea or crushing guilt. No automatic spiral into self-recrimination or desperate mental revision of circumstances that might have changed the outcome. Just quiet acknowledgement of a moment that revealed something fundamental about the person I had become and the relationship that had shaped me into someone I barely recognized. The memorial program bears my mother's photograph from her 60th birthday, the last celebration I attended fully present, before Daniel's needs began systematically interrupting family gatherings. She's smiling in that particular way she had when surrounded by her children and grandchildren, eyes bright with the uncomplicated joy that characterized her approach to love. Unconditional, supportive, nurturing without smothering. Everything I thought I was providing to Daniel, everything I failed to recognize he was systematically destroying in me. The unused boarding pass represents the return trip I genuinely believed I would take in time for her funeral. Scheduled for 36 hours after I left, enough time, I calculated, to provide Daniel the support he desperately needed for his investor presentation and still return for the memorial service. Mathematical precision applied to emotional manipulation, as if love could be optimized through careful time management and strategic availability. That calculation revealed more about my psychological state than I could acknowledge at the time. The assumption that my mother's death could be scheduled around someone else's professional requirements. the belief that grief could be compartmentalized to accommodate competing obligations. The unconscious conviction that Daniel's temporary needs took precedence over permanent losses, that his convenience mattered more than my opportunity to say goodbye to the woman who had given me life and taught me what genuine love looked like before I learned to accept its hollow imitation. These documents rest together not as shrine to past mistakes, but as evidence of possibility for change. Proof that someone capable of such profound self-betrayal could eventually reclaim enough authentic identity to recognize the choice for what it actually was, not inevitable response to legitimate emergency, but conscious decision to prioritize relationship maintenance over fundamental values. Not unavoidable sacrifice demanded by circumstances, but deliberate selection of one person's comfort over my own most basic obligations to family and self. This recognition didn't arrive as dramatic revelation, but through gradual accumulation of perspective that only distance and time could provide. The slow understanding that healthy love doesn't require such choices, that genuine emergencies don't conveniently align with important events in others' lives, that real partnership supports rather than systematically undermines connections beyond the primary relationship. That authentic care enhances rather than diminishes the recipient's capacity for autonomous decision-making and independent relationship maintenance. The lessons extracted from this experience extend far beyond recognition of Daniel's specific manipulation tactics or my own vulnerability to emotional exploitation. They encompass fundamental questions about the nature of love itself, what it requires, what it provides, and what it should never demand from those who offer it freely. Real love, I've learned, doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller, doesn't require systematic sacrifice of other relationships to prove commitment, doesn't demand that you abandon fundamental values to demonstrate devotion, doesn't disguise control as care or manipulation as need, doesn't punish boundary enforcement or withhold affection when independence is maintained. These insights feel obvious now, written in simple declarative sentences, but they were anything but clear during the years when I mistook emotional intensity for depth, crisis management for intimacy, and systematic accommodation for selfless love. When I confused being needed with being valued, being useful with being cherished, being available with being appreciated. The most profound realization hasn't been about Daniel's manipulation, but about my own participation in it. Not victim blaming, but honest accountability for choices that enabled the very behavior I eventually came to recognize as exploitative. The unconscious belief that love required proving through sacrifice. The unstated assumption that worth was earned through usefulness. The deep programming that equated value with willingness to subordinate authentic needs for someone else's comfort and convenience. This programming didn't originate with Daniel, but predated our relationship by years, perhaps decades. Cultural messages about women's roles in romantic partnerships. Family patterns of emotional management and conflict avoidance. Personal history of relationships where love was conditional on accommodation and boundaries were seen as evidence of insufficient commitment rather than healthy self-respect. Daniel didn't create these vulnerabilities, but recognized and exploited them with precision that suggested either conscious strategy or unconscious expertise developed through practice. The systematic isolation that began with reasonable-sounding requests to prioritize relationship over competing obligations. The gradual erosion of independent identity through incremental accommodation of increasingly unreasonable demands. The careful calibration of emotional manipulation to extract maximum compliance while maintaining plausible deniability about deliberate control. Understanding these patterns has proven essential not just for healing from that specific relationship, but for recognizing similar dynamics in other contexts. Professional situations where colleagues deploy emotional leverage to redistribute responsibilities. Friendships where one person consistently dominates through implied consequences when preferences are challenged. Family relationships where guilt is weaponized to override stated boundaries or extract compliance with unreasonable expectations. The hypervigilance developed through this experience hasn't been entirely negative. Enhanced awareness of manipulation tactics protects against future exploitation while allowing authentic connection with people who demonstrate genuine respect for boundaries and reciprocal consideration. The ability to distinguish between compromise and capitulation enables healthier relationship dynamics based on mutual accommodation rather than systematic surrender. Most importantly, the experience clarified what I will and won't sacrifice again. Not dramatic vows or absolute declarations, but quiet certainty about non-negotiable priorities. Family relationships that existed before romantic partnerships and should survive their conclusion. professional integrity that shouldn't be compromised for someone else's convenience. Personal values that remain constant regardless of external pressure or emotional manipulation, designed to override authentic judgment. The funeral I missed cannot be recovered. The goodbye I failed to say cannot be spoken. The daughter I didn't become in my mother's final moments cannot be retroactively manifested through regret or self-recrimination. These losses are permanent, immune to subsequent insight or behavioral change. They exist as fixed points in personal history that inform future choices without being changed by them. But the person who made that choice, who prioritized a manufactured emergency over her mother's funeral, who valued relationship maintenance above fundamental obligation, who confused manipulation with love so completely that she missed the most important farewell of her life, that person has been fundamentally transformed through recognition of what such choices actually represent and cost. The transformation hasn't been dramatic or complete, no perfect healing or absolute wisdom gained through suffering, just incremental evolution from unconscious participation in own diminishment to conscious engagement with authentic values and preferences, from automatic accommodation of others' demands to thoughtful evaluation of what generosity should and shouldn't require, from confused gratitude for being needed to clear understanding of what appreciation actually looks like when genuine rather than strategic. This evolution continues daily through small choices in ordinary interactions. How to respond when colleagues attempt to transfer responsibilities through emotional pressure, whether to accommodate social plans that conflict with personal preferences, how to engage with family dynamics without automatic assumption of conflict management responsibilities, when to maintain boundaries despite potential consequences for others' emotional comfort. Each situation provides opportunity to apply insights gained through expensive experience. Not rigid adherence to defensive patterns, but conscious selection of responses based on authentic assessment rather than programmed reaction. The gradual development of internal compass calibrated to recognize exploitation disguised as need, manipulation presented as crisis, control framed as care. The most unexpected outcome has been discovering capacity for love that enhances rather than diminishes both giver and receiver. Not the desperate accommodation that characterized my relationship with Daniel, but genuine partnership based on mutual respect and reciprocal consideration. The quiet revolution of relationships that support independent flourishing rather than demanding systematic sacrifice for maintenance. This capacity emerged slowly through friendships that survived the Daniel years and professional relationships built on competence rather than accommodation. The gradual recognition that healthy connection feels fundamentally different from the emotional intensity that once seemed to indicate depth but actually signaled dysfunction. That genuine intimacy develops through shared vulnerability rather than one-sided crisis management. That real love creates space for authentic expression rather than requiring performance for approval. The romantic relationship that eventually developed 18 months after leaving Daniel, when emotional healing had progressed enough to permit genuine rather than reactive partnership, demonstrated these principles in practice. Not perfect compatibility or absence of conflict, but adult engagement with differences that didn't require anyone to sacrifice core identity for relationship maintenance. When that relationship ended after 2 years, not through manipulation or crisis, but through honest acknowledgement of fundamental incompatibilities, the conclusion felt healthy rather than traumatic. No desperate attempts to preserve connection through increased accommodation. No assumption that disagreement indicated personal failure requiring immediate correction. Just mature recognition that love isn't always sufficient for sustainable partnership, and that ending relationships doesn't necessarily represent failure by either participant. This experience provided evidence that healing had progressed beyond simply recognizing unhealthy patterns to actually engaging in healthier alternatives. That the capacity for love hadn't been destroyed by Daniel's exploitation, but refined through understanding of what genuine partnership requires and provides. That the woman who once missed her mother's funeral to manage someone else's manufactured crisis had become someone capable of choosing authentic connection over comfortable dysfunction. The memorial program and unused boarding pass remain in my bedside drawer, neither hidden nor displayed, but simply present as reminders of the person I was and the choice that catalyzed becoming someone different. Not dramatic transformation, but incremental evolution through accumulated decisions to prioritize authentic values over external pressure, genuine needs over manipulative demands, real love over its hollow imitation. I missed my mother's funeral for him, and he didn't even say thank you. This truth no longer carries crushing weight, but serves as permanent benchmark for what love should never require or cost. The understanding that gratitude doesn't transform exploitation into gift, appreciation doesn't justify fundamental boundary violation, and no relationship is worth sacrificing irreplaceable moments with people who offer unconditional love without systematic demands for proof through sacrifice. 5 years later, I can say with quiet certainty, I will never again miss something irreplaceable for someone who doesn't even acknowledge its value, not because I've become selfish or defensive, but because I've learned to recognize real love through contrast with its absence. Because I understand now what my mother tried to teach me long before Daniel entered our lives. Love shouldn't require you to make yourself smaller, shouldn't demand that you abandon fundamental values, shouldn't ask you to sacrifice essential parts of yourself to prove commitment worth having. The woman who writes these words carries both the choice that broke her and the healing that followed. Not perfect resolution, but integrated experience. Not complete transformation, but meaningful evolution. Not dramatic redemption, but quiet revolution. The simple miracle of learning to love authentically after surviving love's devastating counterfeit. In the end, perhaps that's the most important thing my mother's death taught me. Not just what I lost by missing her funeral, but what I gained by eventually choosing to leave the relationship that cost me that goodbye. The recognition that real love, the kind she offered unconditionally, the kind I'm now capable of both giving and receiving, supports rather than systematically undermines the people it claims to cherish. And in honoring that recognition through daily choices and ordinary interactions, I've found the best way to say goodbye to the woman whose funeral I missed, but whose love I finally learned to recognize, protect, and share in ways that would make her proud of the daughter who eventually found her way home to herself.